Abortion happens every day. Millions of people around the world will have an abortion each year. But the majority of those people will never talk about their abortion experiences. What if millions of people broke their silence and told the truth about their lives and their choices? This is Melissa Madera in Granville, Ohio, and you're listening to the Abortion Diary podcast. These are the stories we share.
So the end of my sophomore year in college, I had a fling with this man who had recently broken up with his girlfriend. And these were the days before AIDS and everything, so I used a diaphragm and it failed, and I got pregnant. In the meantime, between when we had our fling and when I got pregnant, he decided to get back together with his previous girlfriend. So I was 18 at the time, pretty naive. My mother had never really talked to us about our bodies, about sex or anything. So I felt pretty alone at the time, and it was the end of the year, so a lot of my friends were leaving campus. And I never told him that I was pregnant because there was at that time for me a lot of shame, which I was not dealing with very well. But I did tell my older sister who lived in New York. So she really helped me out. But when I went to New York to have an abortion so I could have somebody there with me, I go in, do all the prep and all. Next thing I know, I wake up in a recovery room. And apparently I had sort of a panic attack and blacked out. So they didn't do it. I've since learned just recently that I have a heart condition, so maybe the stress, because I had a history of blacking out, but not under different circumstances. So then I had to have a special procedure, probably a D&C back then, so that they could put me under anesthesia in a different way. So it was much more expensive. And again, my sister was very poor, but she helped me and got me through that. And one of the things I remember most was when I got back to my dorm room, the next morning, there had a bad reaction to the anesthesia. And I could not move. And it took me almost 45 minutes to be able to move enough to get out of bed. And I was panicked about that because I really thought I was paralyzed or something. And I didn't think that I would be traumatized by the procedure. I had come to terms with it. I was poor. I wanted to finish school. I didn't want my family to know, my parents. But clearly, underneath all of that was a lot of trauma associated with it. But I thought it was the right thing to do at the time. And then that was in May, and that summer I was at an internship in Kalamazoo, and one of the other interns was a date rape when I got pregnant. And he actually disappeared from the program shortly after, so there was no way to come to terms with that or deal with it with him. And the doctor at the time was really hostile to me because I had documented that I had had an abortion already. And so he made some really derogatory statements about, I think he just generalized me as a Black woman who couldn't keep her legs shut or whatever, and sort of threw some birth control pills at me and was very rude. And again, that was not a good scene at all. And again, I was alone at the time. So, and then the one in Rochester was when I was in grad school, and my partner at the time we did actually think about trying to make it work and keeping the child. He was in New York, which was 7-8 hours away. We were extremely poor. I had just started, I was in my second year grad school. So we decided together. But he was really supportive. He was there the whole step of the way. He was a great, so that was not nearly traumatic in that way. And I didn't really think about it that much. I think I've been really fortunate that I did have children. I've also had 3 miscarriages. So the whole thinking of fertility and all of that has been really interesting to me. And then when you came to ask about doing this project, it really made me reflect a lot on why I was so reluctant to share my story, because I think that even though I am glad that I didn't have children when I got pregnant in those early years, because I didn't have the means to support them. I don't know if, adoption was probably not talked about as much then. There still was a reluctance to say it out loud. I think there still is some level of, I don't know if it's shame or just that I think there's been so much anti-abortion rhetoric and press that it still has made me feel uncomfortable just saying, well, I don't feel I should be ashamed, but there's still a reluctance to just say it out loud and to just say, yeah, this was me. And I've shared it with women privately in different circumstances, but not just generally. And, I really support a woman's right to choose what to do with her body. And so I try to support those causes, but more in a quiet way, not in a, and I'm wondering why that is, or why I don't feel more able to be, it's almost like being out in some way, in a different way, because especially now where I work around a lot of religious conservatives, it feels like inviting a kind of conflict that I'm not sure how I would deal with it in a work environment. So I've been thinking about that a lot, what it is that has made me feel that I had to be more silent about it. Because I think now with the kind of violence against abortion providers and it's gotten so much harder to have an abortion in this country. There are so many women who don't actually have access. And it's shocking to me. So I feel that I've been fortunate to have been able to have had that opportunity without question in a time when it wasn't really questioned, whereas now you're so vilified if you choose to have an abortion. So I feel that I have a responsibility to speak out, and yet I still feel silenced. And that's not my style normally, so it's really made me think about, stepping up my game in a way. I haven't quite resolved that one yet. And I think I remember when I first met you and you had your bag with your abortion diaries on, and my first reaction was, wow, that is so brave. Yeah. And I always wondered, how did you get to come to that point, But to me, that was just so incredibly brave. And I kind of wished that I had that kind of chutzpah, as they say, to do that. So I'll get there, I hope.
Do you mind if I ask you?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, first, I do want to say that it's really interesting to me when you did come and say that you wanted to share your story, but that you were concerned about people finding out or recognizing your voice. I was actually really surprised because you're not a quiet person. Like, you're not, like, I don't know you that well, but I know that you're not a quiet person. You're pretty clear about who you are, and like, you say what you need to say. And so that was surprising, but we all have things that we don't tell people, right? So it's like, and this is just the thing that you maybe don't feel comfortable telling people, and that's okay. But it isn't your style, so it's funny that you said that. It's like, I feel like it isn't really your style, but this is just one of those things that you're still haven't figured out how to talk about it or be open about.
Well, I think part of it has to do with, I don't want to make excuses, but I grew up in a family where sex was never discussed. Our bodies, period, never talked about. I'm one of four daughters, but my mother never, it was just, you didn't talk about these things. And so I think I also grew up in a pretty, not totally conservative, but I grew up in a religious tradition where also it wasn't okay. So I think those two things combined, I had certain things pounded into me that you just don't talk about very personal things in general, let alone sexuality, abortion, anything physical or health related. You just never talked about out loud. So to think about giving voice to it, even to myself, let alone to whoever, this could go out to hundreds of people, right? It's very scary to me. It's very scary. I don't know. And a part of it is not wanting to alienate people that I'm trying to change their ways of thinking on other levels about, race and gender and equity, inclusion. I want to be able to have I don't want them to just shut me out because they think of me in a certain light. And so I've been very careful about what I say around some people in general, especially things politically, so that I don't alienate them completely. Because I need to have people be willing to at least hear what I have to say. So I'm struggling with it. I am. Hopefully I'll figure it out. And I have a couple friends who are midwives and who have very different views on abortion and such. And when I got pregnant in my marriage, my husband at the time got very freaked out and wanted me to have an abortion. And I was adamant that I was not. No way, I wanted this child. I really wanted this child. And it was shocking to me that, and when you're married to somebody, they would be so freaked out that they would not want you to have the child. And he really tried to bully me into not having my son. And it was interesting to talk to my friends who were midwives at the time, just about that whole question. Because one of my close friends is very adamant that women should have a right to choose, but she's also hopes that people don't choose that option, So it's really interesting. It's such a complicated, it shouldn't be to me, but it is a very complicated issue.
You mentioned that you come from a very conservative family background.
In some ways.
Religious. Yeah. Religious family background. Have you ever told your family members, besides your sister, about your abortion experience?
Just my sister. But my mother shared with us very late that she had an illegal abortion because she and my father were graduate students. They had one child. They were extremely poor, and they didn't have any money. And all she said about it was that she had a wonderful doctor. And that was the 50s, early 50s. So I was floored by that because, again, she didn't mention that till I was in my 40s. And only because I saw in my birth certificate that there had been an unborn child. Like the old birth certificates talked about how many live births, how many other pregnancies you had or something. I was like, hey, Mom, what's this? So.
But you never shared with her your own experiences?
No.
What's holding you back?
Oh, that's a whole nother. I didn't see the point at this point. I really didn't. I did really push her to talk to my younger sisters about their bodies and such, because I didn't want them to go off to college the way I had, being so naive and ignorant. Fortunately, back then in the 70s, there were the self-help groups, which were really phenomenal. And that's where I learned things. But I just thought it was wrong that she had not talked about this with, me. And my older sister is great, but with my younger sisters, I said, you have to talk to them. And she did. I don't know how much she did, but she did. And I think they have a very different relationship with her as a result. So it's interesting. Yeah. I didn't really feel that. I don't think I shared that kind of intimate stuff with my mother until after I got married and had children, or was having children. I think once my parents were not financially contributing to me in my life, when I was completely independent, then our relationship shifted, and there was more of an equality in our relationship, and we became closer. But when I was a student, there was always that dynamic about money that made it tough. So I just didn't share a lot of stuff with them. And partly because we just never talked about personal things. In my family, there was this. My father never could handle anything that was sort of unpleasant. He would change the subject. He just couldn't handle it.
So I just want to go back to parts of your story.
Mm-hmm.
Your third abortion in Rochester. Can you talk a little bit more about the experience you had finding the clinic, getting the money together, just like your overall experience getting an abortion there?
I don't really remember. Because I think we had student health insurance. And we may have scraped up the money. I seem to recall there was somewhere around $100 or $150 we had to get together, which for me was a lot, but my partner helped a lot. But I know that it was somebody that we were referred to through the student health services. I don't know if they didn't do it there at the student health center, but they had an arrangement with somebody. I know it was another male doctor. And I know that I remember just that he was very kind, but I don't really remember. I think I just went to wherever they told me I had to go. I don't know if there was any choice in finding somebody. And I think same in Kalamazoo, there was I think there might have been a health service at work. Or for the summer interns, they had an arrangement. It might have been with the college. We stayed in these townhouses that belonged to Western Michigan University. So we might have gone through Western Michigan. I don't remember, which is interesting in itself. I just remember the hostility of that person. Yeah. And in New York, my sister found somebody, and it was a woman. It was very kind, but in Rochester, it was just through the student health services, somebody that they had contracted with.
And do you remember what your experience with that person was like?
Not really, because I think because my partner was so supportive, it wasn't a traumatic thing. Um, I don't. How long ago was that? 35, 40 years ago? 35. Yeah.
With your second abortion, there was also the trauma of a date rape
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you were very alone in that process.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever talk to anyone or tell anyone about that experience and the abortion that happened afterward?
I talked to my sister, my older sister. I remember afterwards, I got home. I think I took a cab home. And my father called, which was unusual. And he had called my job and they said I was out sick. So he was very worried. And I just, oh, Dad, I have cramps today, you know. I remember talking to him a little bit. But other than that, and my sister was on her way to an overseas job because I know she wasn't around later in that summer. In the fall she was gone. But no, I didn't. I think it was towards the end of the summer, so most of the interns were gone. I think I had another week of work, and then I had to go back to college. So yeah, I just remember being very alone. Yeah. Because the interns, we did a lot of stuff together, but we weren't so close that I just felt comfortable sharing that. My roommate at the program didn't like me at all and barely spoke to me, so she wasn't somebody I could confide in. And I think there was some shame associated with the date rape. Because we didn't talk about things like that back then. You know, nowadays, he would have been skewered, I hope. I don't know. And then he disappeared, so then I didn't know what to do because there was no way to track him down because it turned out he had lied about a few things. So, yeah.
Did you ever talk about the date rape afterwards or with anyone?
I actually had a chance. I confronted him about 20 years later because we were both in the same profession and ended up living in the same city. And I bumped into him. And there were a couple professional events where we encountered each other. So one time he actually invited me for, go out for drinks. And I think he thought he could whatever. And so I agreed. But when we went out, I said I really laid into him. I think he was floored. Absolutely shocked. But I felt like I had to tell him about the pain and the emotional pain that he had caused me. And the breach of trust in that at that time. It was really a breach of trust. So I never got an apology, but I said my piece to him at least. And like you said before, it's very different from who I think of myself as being in some ways, I think I'm a lot feistier now. I'm a lot more comfortable with myself. Back then I was really not. I think I was pretty young for my age. And so worried about what other people would think. Whereas I think once you get to a certain age, that stuff matters less and less. Clearly it matters some to me, but not nearly as much as it used to. So
Why do you want to share your story?
Well, I think at the time that I had abortions, it was something we took for granted that we could. And now I think we can't do that anymore because there's so many women who don't have, in this country at least, I mean all over the world, right? Some women don't have any choice of birth control or anything, and I find that a whole nother problematic thing. Or they have, so many women die in childbirth, and there's all kinds of issues about reproduction that are really troubling. And I don't think that we should take it for granted. I don't think that we should, and I also think it is important to speak about it. And for women and men to know what happens with people. Because I think if we don't speak about it, then it's like, well, nobody has an abortion, and that's not the case at all, right? A lot of people have abortion, but nobody ever talks about it. None of us. We don't tell each other. We don't share that. We don't, and I hope that I can share it with my daughter and my son. I try to talk to them about their sexuality, about their sexual health, about respecting partners. And my daughter's still young enough that she's like, "Ew, I don't want to talk about it." Boys are yucky. And I'm glad she feels that way right now, but I know that soon she's not going to feel that way. Or maybe she will, and maybe, she'll choose to have women for partners. I don't know, but I just want to be able to talk to her about these things and have her not feel ashamed about her body. I grew up feeling very ashamed about my body. And I still have body image issues. And yet I worked very hard to bring body positivity to my students. So, it's kind of a do as you say, not as I do kind of thing. And partly I just don't want women especially, to have those kinds of hang-ups like I did. And I hope by speaking about it, I can come to terms with some of the conflicts about not speaking about it. I sort of view this as a first step. It's not something I want to go around bragging about or yelling about or anything, but I do think that it's really important for women to have a choice of if and when to have children, because it is such a life-altering, having children is so life-altering, and you should be able to really want to have a child before you have one, not be forced to have a child. And there's so far too many people on this planet, so yeah. So I don't know if I wanted to tell my story, but I just thought it was important to tell my story. It's still hard to do.
I was just gonna ask you, why don't you want to tell your story? Like, what makes it difficult?
I guess it's just something I haven't really talked about. I've thought about it, spoken it. And like I said before, knowing how different people's reactions are so viscerally, I mean, people have such strong reactions to the whole idea of an abortion. So knowing that I might have to confront that in somebody who hears my story is still scary. No, I'll be thinking about these questions for the next month to tell you. come back, I'll have a whole nother set of answers, but I'm not sure.
Well, how do you feel now that you've shared your story?
Well, it's made me reflect on some things that were not so pleasant. I mean, I'm grateful I had those chances, because I think I certainly would not have been able to get a PhD. I certainly would not have been able to have the kind of career that I've had I had children. I wouldn't have had just so many opportunities, or been able to take advantage of opportunities that I've been able to do. I've traveled the world. I've done all kinds of really neat, interesting things that I think those chances, I wouldn't have been able to have had them had I had a child. I don't think I would have been a person to have been able to have a child and give the child up for adoption. Especially now that I've had children, I just can't imagine doing that. I respect women who do, but personally, I don't think I could have. So I'm really glad to have had sort of those second, third chances. It's kind of made me just self-reflective, you know. And I'm still surprised at how hard it is to talk about. I thought it would feel more cathartic than it does. It doesn't. Because it's taking me back to a time far, far ago, and I was a different person then. So I don't think of my journey as a person very often, and sort of really a leap back to a real different time in my life, you know.
Do you think that it was a more difficult time in your life?
Well, structurally, in some ways, I was so poor. I never had money at the end of the month for food. I lived in Rochester, New York, which was very cold. We had to turn the heat off at night, and we would wake up and see our breath in the morning because we couldn't afford the heating bills. So I just remember being so poor, but yet because I was a student, there's a lot of freedom in being a student that I think I didn't realize how many freedoms I had by not being burdened by bills and expectations and job. So there were good times and bad times, right? But yeah, it was hard financially then. I think my life, the difficulties in my life now stem around my ex and what's going on with my children now, but that's a whole nother dimension. I think I was much more idealistic back then. I think the world has become a more difficult place in many ways. There's much more violence. The discourse has become so fractured and hateful and vitriolic, where it was not nearly so much so back then. I think just our lives are so much more, our society is so much more polarized than it was back then, because people can't have open discourse in a respectful way, or they can't disagree in a respectful way. So it's hard to talk about things here now. I think for young people, life is much harder than it was for us. Because even though we didn't have money, we didn't have the sort of societal pressures that we have now. There were societal pressures. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I think people could not be out as queer back then in the ways that people can now in most places. there were a lot of other restrictions, but for me personally, we didn't have as many choices, but we didn't have as many expectations. We didn't worry about finding careers and making money in the way that young people do now. We just assumed we'd figure it out. And I just think we were much more idealistic. So, it was such a different time. And for me, it just seems like it was eons ago.
You talked also about those first two experiences being really traumatic. Have you ever been able to process those experiences and deal with the trauma associated with that?
Well, to some extent, because I don't think that trauma defined me or defined my actions. And I didn't feel it was something I had done wrong. So they were traumatic, but it wasn't something that I let get in my way of what I was doing and where I was heading. I should look for my journals from back then. I know they're still in a box somewhere. Let's see what they say.
This is Melissa, your host and the founder of The Abortion Diary. For more information about the Abortion Diary podcast, visit us on the web at theabortiondiary.com or email me with your questions or comments at melissa@theabortiondiary.com. If you're a fan of the podcast and would like to help us reach more folks, please subscribe on iTunes and write a review or rate this podcast, even if it's not how you listen. Your reviews and ratings will help us grow in the iTunes rankings and reach more people. I would also love to hear from you. And you can also listen to over 150 abortion stories on our website, SoundCloud, Stitcher Radio, or your favorite podcast app. And the Abortion Diary can't continue without your support. I've been self-funding the Abortion Diary for over 3 years and need your help to continue to share our stories. Support the Abortion Diary by making a tax-deductible donation through Fractured Atlas or becoming our patron on Patreon. You can also bring me to your college campus or organization. I use the money generated from that to make more Abortion Diary episodes. If you would like to share your story, send me an email at melissa@theabortiondiary.com or visit our website, click on Share Your Abortion Story, and fill out our contact form. I'm currently in Ohio and look forward to visiting your city or town soon. Thank you to Karen and Scott for hosting me in Atlanta, Georgia, so I could record this story. If you'd like to host me in your city or town, please send me a message. And thanks to you for listening. I'll be back next week with a new story.